In the winter of 1889, a traveling salesman named Thomas Brennan disappeared on a mountain road in eastern Kentucky. His wagon was found 3 days later empty, the horses still hitched and trembling in the cold. Inside the wagon bed, his sample case lay open. Everything was accounted for except Thomas himself. The sheriff's report listed him as lost to the mountains. But that wasn't true. Thomas Brennan wasn't lost, he'd been invited inside. The Frost sisters lived in a timber house at the end of a gulch road where the Appalachian ridge folded into shadow. Margaret was 31. Eliza was 28. Their younger sister, Opal, was barely 19. They had no husbands, no neighbors within 5 miles, no family left to speak of. Their father had died the winter before, frozen in his own barn under circumstances the county chose not to investigate. Their mother had been dead much longer. Some say she walked into the woods one morning and never came back. Others say she never left the property at all. The sisters kept to themselves. They sold preserves at the market in town twice a year, spoke to no one, and left before anyone could ask questions. People said they had a way of looking at you that made your skin go cold. Not with malice, with something worse, recognition. As if they saw what you'd done, what you were capable of, what you kept hidden even from yourself. But they were also known for their hospitality. Travelers along that ridge road, caught in storms or losing daylight, would sometimes see the glow of their lanterns through the trees. The sisters would wave them in, offer hot coffee, cornbread, a place by the fire. There was a guest room, they said, a cellar stocked with smoked meat and root vegetables. You're welcome to stay until the weather breaks, until morning, until you're rested. Most people did stay, and most people left the next day unharmed, grateful, continuing on their way with a strange story about 3 silent women who showed kindness without warmth. But some people didn't leave, and over the course of 18 months, starting in the autumn of 1888, 7 men went missing along that stretch of road. The law wrote it off. Appalachia was unforgiving. Men vanished all the time. Drink, debts, desertion, the cold. It didn't mean anything. But it did mean something. And by the time anyone understood what, it was already too late to stop it. The cellar was accessed through a door in the kitchen floor. Heavy oak planks, iron hinges, a rope handle worn smooth from use. Margaret would lift it with one hand as if it weighed nothing. The stairs descended into darkness that smelled of earth and preservation. Cool air rising. The kind of cold that settles in your chest and stays there. Eliza would go down first, carrying a lantern. Then Opal, her face unreadable. And then the guest, if he accepted the invitation. Most did. When you're cold and tired and a woman offers you shelter, you don't question the architecture of her kindness. You follow the light. The cellar was larger than it should have been. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with jars of pickled vegetables, cured hams hanging from ceiling hooks, sacks of grain and flour stacked in the corner. It looked like preparation, like survival, the kind of storage a family would need to make it through a hard winter. And the winters in that part of Kentucky were always hard. But there was something else down there. A second room, behind a curtain made of old canvas. The sisters said it was for cold storage, for keeping meat fresh longer. They said the temperature never rose, even in summer. They said you could hang a side of venison in October, and it would still be good in March. They said a lot of things. What they didn't say was that the room had no windows, no ventilation, and the door, once closed, could not be opened from the inside. The lock was on the outside. The hinges faced outward. It wasn't designed to keep things cold. It was designed to keep things contained. Thomas Brennan realized this too late. He'd accepted their invitation. He'd descended the stairs. He'd admired the shelves, complimented their industry, asked polite questions about their preservation methods, and when Margaret suggested he see the cold storage room, he'd stepped inside without hesitation. The door closed behind him before he could turn around. There was no violence in it, no struggle, just the sound of the latch sliding into place, and then silence. Margaret, Eliza, and Opal stood outside the door listening, waiting. They didn't speak, they didn't need to. They'd done this before. Thomas Brennan pounded on the door for 3 hours. Then he screamed, then he begged, then he wept. And then, after a long time, he stopped. The sisters went back upstairs. They made supper, they sat by the fire, and they did not go back down to the cellar until morning. The question everyone asks is why? Why would 3 women living alone, isolated, unremarkable in every documented way, do something like this? And the answer, the real answer, is buried in what happened to them long before Thomas Brennan ever knocked on their door. Their father, Silas Frost, was a timberman. He worked the logging camps up north for most of his life, came home twice a year, drank himself into rages, and left bruises that lasted longer than his visits. Their mother, Caroline, raised the girls in his absence. She taught them to can vegetables, to preserve meat, to survive without men, without help, without hope. She also taught them that the world did not care what happened to women in houses like theirs, that no one would come if they screamed, that they were on their own. When Margaret was 16, a man came to the house, a friend of her father's. He stayed 3 days. What happened during those 3 days was never spoken of again, but Margaret changed. She stopped smiling, stopped speaking unless necessary, and when Silas came home that winter, she looked at him with something new in her eyes. Not fear, contempt. Eliza learned the same lesson 2 years later. Another man, another visit, another silence that settled into the walls of that house like rot. Opal was too young to understand it then, but she would learn. They all learned. Caroline Frost disappeared when Opal was 12. The story was that she went walking in the woods and got lost. But the woods around their house weren't that deep, and Caroline knew them better than anyone. The truth, whispered in town but never proven, was that Silas had finally gone too far, that whatever he'd done to her that night had been enough to make her want to vanish. Or maybe she hadn't wanted to vanish at all. Maybe she'd been made to. Silas died a year after Caroline. Frozen in his barn, they said, but the barn door had been locked from the outside, and the temperature that night hadn't been cold enough to kill a man quickly. It would have taken hours, long, slow hours. The kind of death where you have time to think about what you've done, time to regret it, time to beg. The sisters inherited the house, they inherited the land, and they inherited something else. A specific kind of knowledge, that men could take whatever they wanted, that women were expected to endure it, and that if you were smart, if you were patient, if you waited long enough, you could take something back. They didn't start with murder. They started with selection. They learned to read men the way their mother had taught them to read weather, the ones who looked too long, the ones who smiled too wide, the ones whose kindness had teeth behind it. And when those men came to their door, cold and tired and looking for shelter, the sisters would offer them exactly what they deserved. The first man they took was named Jacob Farrow. He was a drifter passing through in the autumn of 1888. He knocked on their door asking for water. Margaret invited him in. He sat at their table, ate their food, and told stories about the women he'd known in other towns. The way he told those stories made it clear what kind of man he was. The way he looked at Opal, barely 18 at the time, made it even clearer. He asked if he could stay the night. Margaret said yes. Eliza showed him to the guest room, but sometime after midnight he came out. He didn't go to the guest room door. He went to Opal's. He tried the handle, found it locked, stood there for a long time, breathing in the dark, deciding whether to force it. He never got the chance. Margaret was standing behind him. She didn't say a word, just pressed the muzzle of their father's old revolver against the base of his skull and walked him downstairs. Eliza was already in the kitchen, the cellar door open. Opal stood at the top of the stairs, watching. They took him down together. Jacob Farrow spent 4 days in that cold storage room. The sisters brought him water once a day. No food, no light, no explanation. On the 5th day he was dead. Exposure, dehydration, despair, it didn't matter which. The result was the same. They buried him in the woods behind the house, in a spot where the ground stayed soft year-round. No marker, no ceremony, just dirt and silence. The second man was a peddler. The third was a railroad worker. The fourth was a preacher, which tells you everything you need to know about the sisters' faith in God. Each one had done something, or tried to do something, or looked like the kind of man who would, and each one ended up in the cellar. Thomas Brennan, the salesman who disappeared in the winter of 1889, was the 7th. The records say he was a family man, a husband, a father of 3, but the records don't say what the sisters saw in him, what he did or said or revealed in the hours before they locked him away. Maybe he made an advance, maybe he made a joke that wasn't funny, maybe he just had the wrong look in his eyes, or maybe, by that point, the sisters didn't need a reason anymore. Maybe the pattern had become the purpose. Because here's the thing about trauma. It doesn't just break you, it teaches you. It shows you how the world works, how power moves, how violence hides. And if you survive it long enough, it gives you a choice. You can keep being the person it happened to, or you can become the person who makes sure it never happens again. The Frost sisters made their choice, and for 18 months, no one stopped them. It ended because of a mistake, not theirs, someone else's. In March of 1890, a man named William Cotter came through the Ridge Road. He was a U.S. Marshal tracking a fugitive through the mountains. He wasn't looking for the Frost sisters. He didn't know they existed. But his horse threw a shoe 2 miles from their property, and by the time he'd walked it to their door, the sun was setting and the temperature was dropping fast. Margaret answered. She looked at him the way she looked at all men, measured him, calculated. But William Cotter wasn't like the others. He was older, careful, observant, a man trained to notice things, and when Margaret invited him inside, he noticed the way Eliza stood too close to the cellar door. The way Opal wouldn't make eye contact. The way the house smelled faintly of lye soap and earth, as if something had been scrubbed clean recently. He accepted their hospitality, drank their coffee, thanked them for the cornbread. But when Margaret offered him the guest room, he declined, said he'd sleep in the barn with his horse. Didn't want to impose. The sisters didn't argue. They let him go, but William Cotter didn't sleep. He waited until the house went dark. Then he circled back, found a window, and watched. He saw Margaret descend into the cellar alone, carrying a lantern, saw her disappear for nearly an hour. When she came back up, her sleeves were rolled to her elbows and there was dirt under her fingernails. Eliza went down next, carrying a shovel. Then Opal, with a bucket. They were efficient, practiced. And when they finally came upstairs and locked the cellar door behind them, William Cotter knew he'd found something worse than the fugitive he'd been hunting. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? William Cotter returned to town at first light. He came back 3 days later with the sheriff, 2 deputies, and a warrant. The sisters didn't resist, they didn't run. When the men knocked on their door, Margaret opened it, looked at William Cotter, and said only this: "You should have stayed in the barn." They found the cold storage room. They found the cellar. And in the woods behind the house, they found the graves. 7 of them, shallow, unmarked, scattered across an acre of soft ground. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition, but all of them were identifiable. Jacob Farrow, the peddler, the railroad worker, the preacher, Thomas Brennan, 2 others whose names were never recorded because no one had reported them missing. The sisters were arrested, taken to the county jail, charged with 7 counts of murder. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented the evidence. The defense argued insanity, trauma, self-defense. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts, sentenced to hang. They were executed on November 14, 1890. Margaret first, then Eliza, then Opal. A crowd gathered to watch, the way crowds always did. Some came out of curiosity, some came out of hatred. Some came because they'd known the men who'd been buried in those woods, and they wanted to see justice done. But most came because they wanted to witness something they couldn't understand. 3 women who'd killed 7 men. 3 sisters who'd built a trap in their own home and waited for it to spring. The newspaper accounts from that day describe Margaret as calm. She walked to the gallows without assistance, stood on the platform, and looked out over the crowd with the same measuring gaze she'd used on every man who'd ever knocked on her door. When the hood was placed over her head, she spoke her only words. "We did what we had to." Eliza was silent. She climbed the stairs, took her place, and waited. No last words, no confession, no apology. The records say she was trembling, but whether from fear or rage, no one could tell. Opal was 19 years old. The youngest, the one who'd watched it all happen, who'd stood at the top of the cellar stairs and learned what her sisters were teaching her. When they brought her to the gallows, she looked at the crowd and said, "You would have done the same." And maybe that's what haunts people the most. The possibility that she was right. The house stood empty for 2 years after the executions. No one wanted to buy it. No one wanted to live where that had happened. Eventually, it was torn down. The land was sold. A new family built a different house on a different part of the property, far from where the graves had been. The cellar was filled in, the woods were cleared, and the story officially was over. But stories like this don't end. They fold into the ground. They settle into the bones of the place. And people who live in that part of Kentucky still talk about the Frost sisters, not as monsters, not as victims, but as something in between. Something the language doesn't have a word for, because the truth is more complicated than the trial made it seem. Yes, they killed 7 men. Yes, they did it deliberately, methodically, without remorse. But those men weren't innocent. At least, not all of them. And the sisters weren't born killers. They were made into something by a world that had brutalized them first and then expected them to stay silent about it. That doesn't excuse what they did, but it explains it. An explanation, uncomfortable as it is what history owes us. Not heroes, not villains, just the truth about what people become when they're given no other choice. The last thing found in the house after the sisters were executed was a journal, Margaret's. Most of it was mundane weather, chores, preserves made and sold. But on the final page, written in her careful hand, was a single sentence. "They came to our door, we let them in, and then we made sure they could never leave. That house is gone now. The cellar is gone. The graves have long since been reclaimed by the earth. But somewhere in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, on a stretch of ridge road that doesn't get much traffic anymore, there's still a place where travelers feel uneasy, where the air gets a little colder, where the trees seem to lean in closer than they should. And if you listen carefully, late at night, when the wind comes through the gulch, you can almost hear it. the sound of a cellar door closing, and the echo of footsteps descending into the dark.